Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I really want to thank in particular the panelists, and we've got a great panel this morning, to have this conversation for about an hour. And I'll tell you, I have two objectives. I'm sure our panelists have other thoughts and other things that they'd like to get done this morning, but I've got two objectives for this morning. Number one, I would like to share with you what I saw at the border, the Texas border, in McAllen and in Brownsville, and just give you a sense for what's going on. It is still, morally speaking, an untenable situation. It's a very difficult situation. And that leads me to my second objective, which is I really want to get feedback from the thoughtful people up here at the panel and all of you on how we proceed from here, legislatively speaking, but across the board. So some of you may be aware that Governor Malloy sent a letter to the Secretary of Health and Human Services with some suggestions on how we might, in the interim period, handle some of the children who've been separated from their families and offering Connecticut's assistance in that project. We will supposedly be voting on the second Republican created immigration bill this week, perhaps as early as tomorrow. It's highly uncertain because a lot of this is driven by a complete lack of agreement on the part of the majority party, the Republicans, and I'm not picking on them, I'm just saying they've chosen to do this on their own, and they're having a hard time getting united behind any particular legislative solution. But also, what else should we be doing? I think 6 of the 7 or 5 of the 7 federal representatives and senators went to the border in the last 72 hours. I saw that Senator Blumenthal was down there. I was down with 3 of my colleagues. And so we're very committed to doing what we can, though we are in the minority in both the House and the Senate, to try to alleviate a situation that most of us find pretty appalling. So those are my 2 objectives. And I think what I'm told to do is to just speak for a couple of minutes about what's going on, and then ask each of our panelists to give 2 or 3 minutes of perspective on the problem at hand, and then we'll open it up to a broader conversation, hopefully with the intent of maybe coming up with some ideas on what we do here. So let me just, and actually it might make sense, before I tell you about what I saw, I'm gonna just hand the microphone and run right down the panel so that you know who is up here and what their area of expertise is, rather than doing lengthy introductions myself. Let's just do it that way.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Larry Rosenberg. I'm former clinical director of the Child Guidance Center in Southern Connecticut and presently the president of the Child and Adolescent section of Division 39 of the American Psychological Association.
Mark Lingle, I'm the executive director of the Interfaith Council of Southwestern Connecticut.
I'm Rachel Doft. I'm the Director of Immigration Legal Services at IRIS, a refugee resettlement agency in New Haven.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kaylee Rector. I'm a staff attorney at the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants. Specifically, I work within our Survivor Services program, which works with individuals who have survived state-sponsored torture.
Hello, I'm Catalina Horag, and I'm the executive director of Building One Community, the Center for Immigrant Opportunity in Stamford, Connecticut.
Good morning. I'm John Moore. I'm a staff photographer for Getty Images, and 2 weeks ago I took a picture of a little girl crying on the border that has received some attention.
Good morning. I'm Carolyn Miles. I'm CEO and president of Save the Children, and we work in 120 countries with children in all kinds of situations, including refugees and immigrants, and we're headquartered right in Fairfield.
Okay, so let me briefly give a summary of what I was able to learn in a very brief period of time on the border. I'd never been to this part of the border before. In fact, I'm not sure I'd ever officially looked at what happens at the border, so a lot of this was new to me. And I walked away with having learned a lot, disturbed by a lot of what I saw, but also an appreciation for both the danger, the risk, and the complexity of the situation that exists down there. So the roughly 23 of us and plus staff got down to McAllen, Texas on Friday night, spent the night, and then early the following morning we visited 3 facilities. We started with a Border Patrol intake facility. So this was a substantially sized facility. Think of a police station, really, right on the border. And it was a facility where the Border Patrol, when they apprehend people who have come across the border, first take them. So it's literally a sally port that people come in, they have a very brief medical checkup, they're showered, they're checked for any signs of violence. There's an initial screening done, they try to determine identity, and then literally they are admitted to this facility, which on the interior is really a jail. It's concrete floors, it's very bare, secure, and they told us that the people were there, and there were roughly 40 or 50 people in this facility, typically stay anywhere from 12 to 36 hours. This is not a long-term holding area, this is an intake place. And it's important, I learned a lot when I was down there, and many of you may have a higher level of sophistication than I did going down there, but Customs and Border Patrol, their job is to operate between points of entry, this particular part. So in other words, they're the ones who are watching the river, literally, and as people come across the river, as they do every hour, they apprehend them, take them into custody. Sometimes they wind up chasing them. This particular location actually was a location where, as I learned, it's a very standard location where I'm told the cartels who control much of the business of guiding people through Mexico. I probably met 20 people. Not one of them was actually Mexican. They were all Honduran, Salvadoran, Guatemalan, guiding these people through the country of Mexico to the border, get them to the border. These people are known as coyotes, and just saying, there's the river, cross it, get on that road, walk north. In some cases, they're actually told to turn themselves over to CBP, Customs and Border Patrol. Anyway, that's the role of those individuals there. And that's an important distinction because when people cross the border not at a port of entry, in that moment they have committed a crime, technically speaking, as opposed to if they present themselves to a port of entry and say that they are seeking asylum, which is not illegal. And that's an important distinction because the president's rhetoric is one, and this is really my main objection to what's coming out of the White House, is this dehumanizing rhetoric that these people are all criminals. It's rooted in that notion that if you cross the border not at a point of entry, technically speaking, you have in fact broken US law. Just to get back to what actually occurred, so you have 6 holding cells. It's quite Spartan. I got a little attention because I described what it looked like to see. There was a group of mothers in one secure area, glassed away, and initially they weren't going to let us speak to them, but we pressed, and so they opened one of these cells that had about 20 girls underneath Mylar. You see an awful lot of Mylar blankets. I don't know the technology of Mylar blankets. You see people after they run marathons and that sort of thing, clothed in these things. Anyway, Mylar blankets everywhere. These 20 girls stood up, and they looked exactly like you would expect young people would look after finishing a trek through the country of Mexico and going across the Rio Grande and being apprehended. The mother and 2 children from Honduras were selected to have a conversation with us. She did say that they'd been very well treated by CBP. They didn't feel scared. It occurred to me in that moment that as awful as, I don't know how many of you have ever been in a prison environment, as awful as that environment was, this is one of the complexities of the border, having just taken 2 teenage girls across 1,000+ miles of Mexico and all of the uncertainty under the control of the cartels, you can imagine how they felt to actually be, in a place that, as ugly as we would think it to be, I suspect felt a lot safer than where they had spent the last 30 days. So we had conversation. They said they were being well treated. This particular family had not been split up. This was obviously after the executive order, which we'll spend a few minutes on. Subsequently, we went just next door to a holding facility, which is not a intake spot. This was, think Walmart. It was a huge warehouse space where, in fact, they had, I'll use the word, they had cages set up. These were think of, you've seen the pictures of, a tennis court surrounded by chain link fences with, in one case, 50 young boys in one, in another case, what looked like a bunch of mothers with children, in another case, fathers with sons. And so you had a combination of people who were with their children, as well as a lot of children who were either unaccompanied or had been split prior to the executive order from their parents. Now again, you know, if you don't spend a lot of time in that environment, it looks pretty ugly, and it is pretty ugly. I will tell you, however, that everybody was being issued new clothing, they had access to showers, to bathrooms, to food, to medical care. There was a whole table set up where consular officials could come and talk to individuals. I have no idea what that process looks like. But, so yes, there were unaccompanied children, and there were children who had been split from their parents in that environment. And this points to one of the big questions, which is what happens now that the executive order has been made, and these CBP people, you know, who have lived under two different, you know, rubrics in 1 week, are sort of, their heads are spinning, and so, okay, now now they have to open up new cages where they can keep families together, but now they have a problem, right? Because a family is not always a family. Sometimes a family is comprised of, you know, dad and a neighbor's kid, and they worry, and they, you know, as you're probably sensing from my monologue here, I came away with a certain amount of sympathy for the officers of CBP who also are on the lookout for child trafficking. You know, just because somebody presents with 2 young children, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a parent. So there's a lot of uncertainty in this situation, and these agents who are essentially law enforcement people are placed under an immense amount of pressure, and you know, obviously a lot of scrutiny lately. But nonetheless, that was the scenario there. We were told that no one stays in that long-term detention facility for more than 72 hours. That turned out, and they admitted that because of flooding down there and a variety of other reasons, that people had been there for longer. We talked to a bunch of people who had been there as long as 8 or 9, 10 days, so they're clearly kind of backed up. And then finally, and here's the third installment, here ends this long story. They took us to the South Padre Island ICE detention center. So now this does look like, to my eyes, sort of a maximum security prison. It's in the middle of 100-degree desert, low buildings, lots of concertina wire. And in the buildings there, and I wish I could show pictures, but they wouldn't permit any devices in any of the buildings. There it is a prison environment, don't think gangs and danger and everything. It's a very controlled environment. But there, and this was probably the emotionally most difficult portion of the trip, when they asked, and as it happened, I was the only Spanish speaker, so I was the one doing the translating for the members who were there. You know, going into this longer-term detention facility, you know, they wondered, had they selected people to talk with us? Well, here's where the lie was put to that notion. They had brought about a dozen women into a room to meet with us, and without exception, these were women who had had their children taken away from them at the border. And as you might imagine, they were very, very upset. They were initially quite suspicious of who we were and what we were doing there. It's, of course, a very strange thing. If all you've seen is uniformed people, and all of a sudden you've got, you know, Rosa DeLauro and Jim Hines and a bunch of other folks showing up. It was a very emotional moment, though, because of the 12 women, only 2 or 3 had any sense of where their children were. So 2 or 3 were told, well, your child's in Michigan, you know, New York. One had had a very brief phone call. The rest of the women had no idea. Hadn't been told. There's a Kafkaesque system there where, you know, if there's credit in your account, apparently this is what they do in prisons, if there's credit in your account, you can make long-distance calls, you can call back to Guatemala, but how do you get that credit into the account? So it's impossible to draw the conclusion of whether the system is naturally that brutal. It might be, or whether they were a little overwhelmed in such a way that they didn't have the people to kind of work with individuals to get them connected. Now, we were assured by senior people at all of these locations that they were taking seriously the notion of not separating families, but nobody had a plan to reunite families. And in fact, the Border Patrol chief at the first station said he'd already reunited, I think he said 100 or so families that were under his custody. But he did that on his own initiative. There's no plan. And here's here's where I add 2 more minutes and then stop talking. As you probably know, so what I've just described is a more complicated situation than I had anticipated. It is still a morally repugnant situation. If you have people who have been separated from their children and it's not an absolute priority to make sure that at a minimum mom or dad knows where the child is, that is a brutal situation. I mean, I wouldn't use the word because it has legal implications, but that's a torturous situation if a mom has been separated and doesn't know where the child is. So it is still a morally repugnant situation with respect to the separations. And there is no plan to either reunite, nor is there clarity on where we go after the executive order, because I suspect many of you know this. The executive order tells the people that I met, Border Patrol and ICE agents, not to separate families. And, by the way, continue to prosecute. Now, under the law, if you're prosecuting, you cannot have children in an adult penal facility. So you've got this paradox that the White House has not yet figured out how to solve, although you can tell where they're pointing. What they're doing is they're asking, the president has asked the Attorney General to go back to the judge who sat on the Flores settlement, which is a fairly complicated thing, but basically says that you can't hold children for more than 20 days, except there is some flexibility, but in any event, children need to be held whenever they're held in the least restrictive environment, and has directed the Department of Defense to make room or find room for up to 20,000 detainees. These would presumably be families with their children. So you can see where the administration is pointed here. It relies, of course, on the judge in the Flores case, who I understand it was a Clinton appointee, reversing the Flores agreement, and then all of us being comfortable with potentially indefinite detention of detainees. Yes, the families would be together, but on military bases without a clear mechanism to adjudicate the individual cases. Last point. What makes this particularly complicated is, as I alluded to before, there is nothing illegal about showing up at a port of entry and saying, I'm seeking asylum because I fear for my life in my country of origin. Some of us, our families, probably took advantage of that very humanitarian notion consistent with international law. We don't begin to have the resources at the border in terms of administrative judges and others to figure out who, in fact, is in fear of their life because they're targeted by a gang in El Salvador or by cartels in Honduras or whatever. And so not only do we not have even the infrastructure to keep families together in a way we would consider humane, we don't have the infrastructure to weed out those who truly have a case for asylum and those who have simply migrated looking for better economic circumstances. So, in conclusion, very complicated situation, remains even subsequent to the executive order, in my mind, morally repugnant in the sense that there's still thousands, I think, I'm told, thousands of men and women who have no idea where their children are, and no real clarity in terms of what happens next after this executive order. So that's my book report. I'm conscious of the fact we've got some really terrific expertise up here, so I want to shut up and allow, maybe we'll start, if it makes sense, Carolyn, with you, because you've got a real global perspective on this, and I'll just ask people to maybe remark for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a dialogue with everybody here.
Thank you, and let me first thank Congressman Hines. We are really lucky to have him in a leadership position here. It makes me proud. Proud to be living here in Connecticut and to have our organization headquartered here. So I wanted to just make 3 points, and I want to start with the point of who these families and children are. And obviously everything I say will be couched in what's best for children, because that's what Save the Children does in every country where we work around the world, including here in the United States. So I was in El Salvador about a year ago, and I was there visiting some programs that were actually funded at that point by the US government. There is a set of programs funded in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador that were funded there to combat violence. And I met a young boy who was 13, And he told me the story of how his best friend was beaten by a gang who wanted him to join that gang. And as he was holding his friend bled to death in front of him. And that boy said to me, I'm not sure I'll ever actually become a grown-up in my country of El Salvador. So those are the people, not all, but those are many of the families that are coming here to the United States, and they are seeking asylum. And you know, we work all around the world, and most of the time when children get separated from their families, it's because of a hurricane or an earthquake or a civil war, or they're fleeing violence. I have never seen in my 20 years with Save the Children where parents and children were forcibly separated in one of those situations. And that's what's happening here in the United States. And that's just morally wrong, and it's certainly wrong for children. So my first point is these are people who are coming here and they are seeking asylum. And they have the legal right to seek asylum, and I actually believe they have that right. There's lawyers on the panel, so they know better than I. Both at a port of entry and along the border anywhere. There is a legal right in the United States and international law that says you can seek asylum. And many of these families, that's exactly what they're doing, like the one I just described. So we need to have a process to go through those cases that are seeking asylum and make sure that we do that. And that is something that these kids and these families deserve. The second point that I want to make is about the trauma that affects these children. Again, we see separated children everywhere around the world. We know that that is real trauma. Any of us who are parents just have to think about the terror that we feel and our kids feel when they get lost in a store, right? We know what this is about. These are young children. This is real trauma, and as it goes on, and as parents don't know where their kids are and kids don't know where their parents are, this trauma goes on, and it's lasting, it's mental, it's physical, it's something that we are doing to these children. And we have to recognize that we're doing this to these children, and we're going to have to do something about that. And the third thing I would say is that we really need to look now at what's going to happen. We're in this double jeopardy, as we were talking about, where we've said, okay, now we're not going to do separation of kids. We're going to put kids back with their families, but under the Flores Act, we're not allowed to do that. So our kids are going to become separated yet again from their families. So the final message I guess I would leave with you all is that whatever we come up with, we really do have to think about putting children first. We really have to think about kids, their rights, their needs. We as adults are the ones who are supposed to be protecting children. That's our obligation, and we really need to put that at the top of our agenda as we think about how do we go forward and what do we do to make sure that these kids are reunited with their families, are not harmed in addition to the harm that we've already done to them, and that we have a path forward. So, thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. I mentioned that I had been on the border several weeks ago. I had been on a trip photographing the U.S. Border Patrol. I've done that many times over the years because I've photographed for my company, Getty Images, the border and immigration issues in general for the last 10 years. That's been not the only thing I've worked on, but consistently over time. And I've been out with the Border Patrol probably 50 times or more during that time. 2 weeks ago, on that night, I had been out with an agent watching people come across the river in inflatable rafts and coming up on the U.S. side, where folks went through the woods and all reached a meeting point on a dirt road. And the Border Patrol shone their spotlight on them and took them all into custody as asylum seekers. And when they do that, they take everyone's possessions away, personal possessions, whether they be jewelry or wallet or backpack, even shoelaces, as part of their security protocol. And they patted everyone down. All the adults frisked people as they put everyone into a van. And when that particular photo was taken, the mom was being patted down to go for transport. I spoke with her very briefly. I didn't have much time to talk to her. She was from Honduras and her daughter was 2, and they'd been traveling for a month. And as security officer patted her down for transport. She had to set her daughter down, and the little girl immediately started crying. And so these pictures are really from a brief time of separation right then. I was not able to know if they would be separated or not. All I knew was they were being transferred to a processing center where those decisions would be made. And of course it came out late last week that in fact they weren't separated, which was a relief to me, a great relief on one hand, but the fact that every family now, or most families, will be held in detention centers in perpetuity during these asylum case proceedings is something which is new. During the previous administration, people were given a court date for the future and then released to go to court later on. And that is not the case now. So although family separations may have ended, zero tolerance is very much in effect and is a much greater and bigger policy issue than pure separation of families. And so we're going to see that play itself out as the government builds very large-scale detention centers, and it's all very much in flux. I'll be back on the border again at some point soon and continue covering immigration because it's important to me, and thank you very much.
Thank you, John. So, just like Carolyn, I want to make 3 main points. We just heard her story about this young boy from El Salvador. And, you know, she heard that story in El Salvador. We hear stories like that almost every week at Building One Community. So, I just want to make sure that you understand that this is a global issue, this is a national issue, but this is also a local issue. This is happening again and again in our own backyard. Stories that break your heart, kids that are coming as unaccompanied minors, trying to reunite with a father who has been here for a long time, or coming to be with a relative. So it couldn't be more real than this. The second point is, we're talking about family separation, right? And we're talking about what is happening at the border and whether or not these, you know, young babies like the little girl that John saw were separated from their families. Well, family separation takes many shapes or forms, and it's also happening in our own backyard. The families who are being deported with absolutely no criminal backgrounds, people who have been here for 20, 25 years, who received bad legal advice or made a very minor mistake 15, 20 years ago. Just in the last, on Saturday morning, I got a phone call on my cell from someone who is going to go through a deportation procedure, and honestly, I don't think there's anything that she's going to be able to do. She has 2 kids, 17 and 19. All she wants to do, you know, one goes to is going to UConn and Stanford, the other one is at one of the high schools in Stanford. It's a matter of weeks before this woman has to go, and unfortunately, there's no quote-unquote compelling humanitarian case that we can make to try to get any kind of emergency stay with ICE. We're going to try to go do it, but it's not. So let's just keep in mind that what family separation looks like here. And the third thing, I just want to share the story because it's really interesting. John was at our center on Thursday night sharing his photographs and photographs from his book that gave the whole background about what is happening at the border, why is it that people come, and the realities that people are fleeing. So we're not just talking about economic migration. Yes, many of them come for economic reasons, and honestly, having been to Guatemala and having spent time in some of these really very poor villages, as an immigrant myself and as somebody who grew up in a poor country like Colombia, I've never seen the poverty and the issues that people have to deal with in these rural areas of countries like Guatemala. So it's not just economic migration, right? It's the reasons, but on Thursday night, John was at our center. On Friday morning, one of our case managers was talking to a woman about 50, 55 years old. Long story short, she just came from the border, okay? She came with an electronic bracelet. She crossed the border from Guatemala with 2 children. One, her own child, age of 15. The second one, 12 years old, at that family unit, the grandson. She was immediately put in those cages. They were doing the intakes. She could see the two boys, at all times. And then she saw that the younger boy started having some health issues. So they called some kind of medical personnel and they took him away. And when she saw that they were taking him away, she pretended to be sick. And so they also had medical personnel and they took her away. So they were both at the hospital. They found out right away, and this is not in Texas, this is in Arizona. And they found out right away that there was nothing wrong with her. They sent her back to the detention center. She's never seen the boy since then. She was given that, the boy was given that, allowance for the phone calls. So he has called twice, but again, he runs out of money, and when he's having a conversation, the mother is in Stanford. So there are lots of inconsistencies, and she was able to let go. She was let go with the 15-year-old boy, and she has an electronic bracelet. So we were very surprised to see that under this zero tolerance policy, she was actually let go last week. She was, but then, the grandson stayed behind. So this is an incredibly complicated issue. It's an issue that is touching our communities. And I just want to make sure that we all understand that this is not just in the newspapers. This is in our own backyard. And Fairfield County has the highest number of undocumented immigrants in the entire state of Connecticut. And there's a very big connection between the affluence of Fairfield County and the reason why we have so many undocumented immigrants. So this is an issue that for those of us who have the fortunate to have a high level of education and the means to have a very comfortable life, we, in our own affluence, have attracted this segment of the population, so we all have the responsibility to support them and to deal with them and to humanize them and treat them as human beings.
Hi everyone, again I'm Kaylee Rector and I'm with the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants. I mentioned before that I'm a staff attorney for a grant-funded program within our organization that serves primarily survivors of state-sponsored torture. So by virtue of the eligibility for that program, the vast majority of the individuals that I represent are asylum seekers. So a lot of what's been happening in the news is been speaking very, very directly to the people that I interact with and represent on a daily basis. I think one of the most important things that I'd like to try to convey from my experience is the impact of detention and what that can mean for somebody in a legal case. So first of all, when we're talking about representation of asylum seekers, I think one of the most important and kind of jarring statistics is what a difference it can make to have an attorney in terms of success versus not. An individual who is seeking asylum who is unrepresented has a 1 in 10 chance of success. That jumps to a 1 in 2 chance when they're represented. Now, when we're talking about somebody who is in detention, the access to legal representation decreases significantly, and I'm referring to statistics from TRAC, which is at Syracuse University. So they have been looking at numbers from back since 2000, and the numbers of individuals in detention who have been able to seek representation has been at its lowest 10%, and the number of individuals who have been able to obtain representation for somebody who is detained has been as low as 10% since 2000, and for individuals who have never been detained has been as high as 80%. So you can see the huge disparity just in the access to legal representation. And one of the things that Catalina mentioned was how often people can get bad legal advice and how much of an impact that can have on the rest of their immigration history. Just to give an example, last week I met with a 16-year-old boy from Guatemala. And he was able to cross the border before a lot of what we're seeing in the news happened, so he was able to make it here, and he's now with a relative. He and I were able to sit down for 2.5 hours, and we were able to talk through his entire case. I was able to screen him for asylum. I was able to screen him with special immigrant juvenile status, which is available for individuals, for minors who have been abused, neglected, or abandoned by a parent. For a T visa, for a U visa, all of these forms of potential relief that he might be eligible for. I was able to have an in-depth conversation with him about what to expect in the removal proceedings that he was about to face in immigration court. And he left my office much more empowered because he had that information, which is not readily available to individuals who are not able to get that, usually through an attorney. So when we're talking about families and children who are being detained for potentially indefinite periods of time, for me as an advocate, that's really scary, because I see these cases as a matter of life or death. And that's what my clients tell me when I talk to them. I don't take them lightly. And I think it speaks to the integrity that we hold for our legal system of whether or not we want these individuals to be able to be connected with the legal representation that would allow them to receive the protection that they are eligible for under our law. And I fear what the impact may be on individuals who are unable to obtain representation, who are unable to speak with an attorney, who may otherwise be eligible for asylum and may otherwise receive a grant of asylum had they been represented. And even if somebody is able to receive representation while they're in detention, I just want to talk about the reality of what that means from a case preparation basis. When I'm preparing an asylum case, oftentimes that means 100, 200, 300 hours of work, many of which are done directly with the client. Because this is their story, I need to know everything about what happens to them, and we spend a lot of time working together as a team. Additionally, we may have evaluations done, physical, psychological, to document the evidence of persecution. There are a lot of steps that go into forming a strong asylum case to give my clients the best chance that they have. As I'm sure you can imagine, that kind of freedom is not available to an attorney who is only able to meet with their client in a very restricted setting in a detention facility. You know, how is that client going to be able to attend a 2-3 hour physical evaluation? There certainly may not be anybody available at the detention center. You know, for example, we have a few places in Connecticut that we're able to send clients in New Haven and Hartford, but if you are in a detention facility, you don't have access to that, and those kind of evaluations can be incredibly compelling pieces of evidence. So again, even for somebody who's able to obtain representation, what is the quality of that representation if they are in detention? And I think something that doesn't make sense for me is why this is necessary. You know, we've seen a lot in the news about how these people are committing a crime by entering. Yes, it is true that under our law, it is a misdemeanor for the first offense of entering the United States without inspection or without proper documentation. A misdemeanor that's punishable by up to 6 months in prison. That's not necessarily what our prison systems are for. Our justice system has a wide breadth of discretion when determining when to detain individuals and for how long, and there's a reason for that, because as we know with our own criminal justice system, we don't have the resources to hold every single person in a facility who has committed any single crime imaginable. So to me, it does not make sense for our resources, but also again for the integrity of our legal system and what access we want to provide these individuals who are turning to our country as a means of safety that they are unable to find within their own governments. So I really wanted to just convey that as somebody who is working on a first-hand basis and kind of seeing the impact that this may have on somebody's legal rights and whether or not they're able to remain here. And then of course the scary question is, if they're not, what waits for them at home?
Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Rachel Daunt from IRIS, a refugee resettlement agency in New Haven. I want to talk about a couple of aspects of this really appalling crisis this morning. But I'll just start with IRIS and how the legal struggles that people who are showing up at our borders, how their legal struggles actually pertain to what we do at IRIS and what we've done historically. So we resettle refugees from all over the world. These are people who have been forced to flee their country because of persecution, war, or violence. And the definition of refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. These people cannot return home, or they're afraid to do so. So asylum seekers, the people who we have been focused on, or the country has been focused on in recent weeks, these are the very same people. They are people, unlike refugees, they have not been given protections ahead of time, but they are in that same position. They are coming to this country seeking those very same protections. And we have we should have just as much care and concern for these people as we do refugees. All of these people are fleeing hideous situations and circumstances. I know there's been a kind of widely circulated poem these days by Warsan Shir, Home, but it says so eloquently, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. So if we take our refugee program in this country seriously, and we do, it's been in existence for many, many decades, we must be serious about the rights of people to seek asylum. So this administration has chosen to prosecute criminally, as Kaylee just mentioned, for misdemeanor crimes. That is not necessary. We have a civil system of laws in this country that are able to handle this crisis. That is how we avoid the nightmare of family separation. This whole crisis is kind of a nightmare of its own making. It's not necessary. We have a civil system. We may not like the fact that people are deported at all, but they are, and ICE handles that. I haven't been to the border, and so I haven't seen exactly what it looks like there, but I know that our federal civil immigration system is one that is in place. And there's no reason to go this unnecessary zero tolerance route. Also, one interesting addition to that point is, I don't know if people saw it this week's Times, Sonia Nazario op-ed, but she makes the point that from an economic perspective, it doesn't even make sense what we're doing. This hunger for and predilection for using the criminal laws where they're unnecessary is also wasteful. She describes, the op-ed is called There's a Better, Cheaper Way to Handle Immigration, and she actually explains a system that was in place, a pilot program that Trump later canceled, that puts into place a family management program where people who have legitimate asylum claims are allowed to make them. Other people are processed through immigration court. She cites the statistic that 99% of people show up for their immigration hearings. There are people wear ankle monitors. It's harsh in its own way, but it has worked, and this is something that the Trump administration has now canceled and wants to be tough on immigration and has gone the criminal route. It's completely unnecessary. So I would say that moving forward from here, we should demand that families that are apprehended are treated fairly, that they're kept together, and that they're allowed to assert asylum claims for all the reasons that we've all talked about. Many people should be allowed to access the protections that our government entitles them to. And they should only be detained for as long as it takes to assign them immigration court cases, if at all. And of course, most importantly, there has to be a plan for the immediate reunification of the 2,300 children who have been separated from their parents. It's appalling, and that should be the first thing people are talking about.
Thank you, Rachel. Before we hear from our last two panelists, I was neglectful at the start of this. Big thank you to Stepping Stones Museum for hosting this. Thank you guys, you're a great member of the community. And I also noticed about 10 minutes ago, we're joined by the mayor of Norwalk, Harry Rilling, and I'm particularly glad, thank you for being here. Mayor Rilling, apart from presiding over a city that has a huge number of immigrants, documented and undocumented, as a former chief of police, saw up close and personal some of the very challenging situations that face this community. So thank you for being here, Mayor.
A few quick comments. Again, to echo the thank you to Congressman Himes for holding this morning, and also to echo the leadership that is appreciated on the part of you in this regard to this issue, but also on so many other issues And I'm very thankful for our legislative leadership across the board. I think we are very fortunate to be where we are, and these voices are critical at this time. Obviously, from a religious perspective, this is immoral, and the religious communities are extremely opposed to what is happening. Not only the separation of children and families, but also the fact that there is no plan for the reunification of children and with their families. I think that the important thing for religious communities at this time is to partner with the various organizations that are here at the table and other organizations in the community to support them in their work. And that is something that we clearly want to be about. I think that we have leadership within Norwalk as well as in Stamford, and I'm very thankful for that leadership as well. The reality is that, as Catalina was mentioning, this isn't just something that's happening on the border, but it has implications for the communities who are, where we live. And one of the things I'm very aware of is that the majority of the faith communities in Stamford and Norwalk are largely immigrant communities, storefronts, homes, communities that meet in the afternoon or during the week in the churches that are there, and they are feeling that impact as well. So part of what we seek to do is to support those communities and their concern, rightly so, for the fact that they're worried about their status and what might happen to them, and the issue of due process that isn't necessarily being followed on the border. The other thing I would say is that as religious communities, we have an opportunity not only to work in the communities, but also nationally. And we have our larger judicatories, I know, are active in Washington as well as elsewhere in terms of advocating for what is right and what is just. The final thing I would say is just that when we talk about faith, oftentimes I think people take out the whole issue of reason, and to me, this is the time that we need to be reasonable and rational. And again, thank you to Congressman Himes for getting information at the border, but also understanding and articulating the complexity of the issue that is there. And that doesn't mean that we kind of throw our hands up. It's that we act in ways that are compassionate and just, but also recognize the complexity of the issue. And to me, the major piece of what has happened recently is that we have lost our moral standing in the larger world. And that is something that I, as both a religious individual but also a citizen, am deeply troubled by. How do we regain that in this time?
Thank you. I too want to thank Congressman Himes for holding this event and for allowing me to participate in this conversation. He's been a long-standing advocate for children's mental health issues, and I think we all appreciate that. I prepared some remarks. I was asked to talk about childhood trauma. It sounds to me rather like a clinical issue in the midst of all this other more human sort of conversation. But I'll talk about it and conclude with a childhood story that I think will interest you. But first, somebody mentioned children, not having heard about children being removed from their families abruptly and harshly in this sort of way over whatever period of time. There have been previous times in history that children have been removed from their families. It occurred with our treatment of Native Americans, it occurred during slavery, and it occurred during the Holocaust. I'm not comparing the immigration issue to those three times in our history. But the issue of separating children from their parents could be understood in all of those previous times in history as being the worst components of them. Childhood trauma is defined by the experience that one has in reaction to an event or a series of events that are perceived to be of catastrophic danger to the self, or life-threatening. Particularly in young children, a perceived threat to a primary attachment figure will be experienced by the child as posing a comparable threat. That is, as though your life were in danger. We know that trauma is toxic to children. It is a magnitude of stress that imposes itself on brain development, cognitive functioning, making it difficult to attend, to concentrate, to organize one's thinkings and one's emotions. Trauma involves a sense of peril so great as to produce overwhelming emotion that leaves one feeling helpless, paralyzed, unable to organize one's thoughts, and entirely unable to cope. It leads to feelings of helplessness, despair, rage, and ultimately withdrawal, and in some cases, failure to thrive. It increases a child's vulnerability to learning difficulties, aggression and antisocial behaviors, depression, and suicide. Parenthetically, the rate of suicide in this country has risen by 25% over the last 20 or so years. It minimizes the chances of children ever reaching the potential of their capabilities. The mental health profession has known this and empirically demonstrated it for decades now. But all of us, by way of our experience as parents and by way of our memories of childhood, know instinctively of the terror and harm that surrounds the loss of a parent. If the Trump administration doesn't know that, it's shameful. If they do know that, it's more shameful. We know too that those most vulnerable to trauma are those that have experienced it in the past. Exposure to violence, the need to flee one's country in order to seek safety, and the trek across hundreds, if not thousands of miles to gain asylum are potentially traumatizing events as well. Excuse me. And they are events experienced by all those children taken from families at our borders. Children require parents to provide them with a sense of well-being, to comfort them, allow them to feel secure, to regulate their emotional state when confronted with stressors, and to feel loved. Without the benefit of that which we too often take for granted, they are lost. Another story. All of you, I'm sure, have seen The Wizard of Oz. In the original novel by Frank Baum, but it is a little bit different. And there's a scene in it where Dorothy is talking with the Tin Man and the Lion and the Scarecrow about, they're all introducing themselves to each other and talking about the reasons that they've come to Oz and what they're hoping to gain from the wizard. And after each of them concludes telling their story, they ask Dorothy to tell hers. And she talks about having been in Kansas, and they ask her to describe it. And she describes it as a place that has terrible winters with storms and snow and freezing ice and so on. And I'm paraphrasing a bit. And then she talks about what it's like in the summer and the extreme heat and wind-blown tumbleweed and storms that are so fierce that they can blow your house up into the sky in a way. And the Scarecrow says to her at that point, "Why would you want to go back to such a godforsaken place?" And she says to him, "You only ask that question because you have no brain. Everyone knows there's no place like home."
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you to the panel. We've got a little bit of time here. I do want to leave an opportunity for those of you who've been good enough to come this morning to ask this remarkable panel with a lot of different perspectives, whatever questions you may have. So, Sean, how are we going to do this? Are we going to just, okay, yes, yeah.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I just have a quick question because I heard something pretty disturbing this morning, which kind of solidifies it. It's from Mayor de Blasio on the news this morning. He mentioned that in New York, he actually found a 9-month-old child baby. My question is, and he kind of touched on that, is that I guess the American Red Cross tweeted this morning, they couldn't get a list of all the 2,000-some separated children. They can't even get it, and this is the American Red Cross. Is there an effort, or is there a way to get some decent Republicans in the party to join forces in a bipartisan effort to force the White House to produce a list, literally, of all the children that are in custody? I'll call them in custody because literally they are in custody. That could help all this mess that's going on. Because if there's no list, there's really no evidence how many they really are. There's got to be bipartisan support on this. There's got to be some decent people other than Democrats at this point, as far as I can see. Because if they're 9-month-old babies, they can't speak for themselves. You've got 15-year-olds, 13-year-olds, they can talk. But if you have toddlers who just know to cry, I mean, I have full-grown children now. I can see torture.
You asked a political question, so let me start with that and tell you what I've been told, and then I'm going to send the mic this direction for somebody who may know a little bit more about the actual procedure of making sure that no one gets lost in the system. So your political question was, is it possible that Republicans could join in to demand a list? The answer to that question is yes. And in fact, one of the remarkable things, I see some activists here, one of the remarkable things about this political moment is that activism works, and I have an awful lot of Republican colleagues who realized that this was a step too far and remarkably became vocal about it on a using moral language. And I don't want to get too political here, but to say that we've seen this before with the remarkable public outcry that rose up against the notion of simply repealing the Affordable Care Act, which would have devastating consequences on a lot of people, and on this issue. So the answer to that question is yes, I think we can get it. It's a little complicated for one reason, and I'm going to sort of send the mic this way to whoever has a little bit more insight on this. What happens is, with these children, they get turned over to a unit of Health and Human Services called ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and then they are sent around to qualifying agencies around the country, including Connecticut. And what I'm told, and I've not seen this proved, and that's why I'm going to send the mic that way, what I'm told is that what I was told at the border was that every child and every individual is issued something called an A number, and that they have the ability to make sure that parents' A number links with child's A number. I was also told, no shocker here, that it is not super easy because now you're dealing with the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, and then the Health and Human Services. They don't have a database that necessarily unites those two numbers. Apparently it takes some work, and I'm just looking this way to see if anybody has any further. Nobody does. Okay, well that seems to be the state of where we are. But obviously, I think one of the things we need to do is demand, not just conceptually, the reunification, but Congress needs to provide, and you need to provide the demand and the oversight that no, not one single child falls through the cracks.
I was just going to say what's interesting about that is A numbers come up in what we do because everyone who's here legally has an A or an alien number. So it's interesting to me, I would really hope that every parent and every child has a number attached to him or her. I haven't heard that, and the only skepticism I have is just that if the government's position is that they're not here legally, I wonder how they're assigning numbers that they usually reserve for people with legal status, but I hope that's the case, and I guess I would just hope there'd be some follow-up. That would be a positive development.
So when somebody's put into removal proceedings or kind of colloquially deportation proceedings, they are assigned an A number which tracks them in court, almost the same as if you would think of a docket in one of a different sense of a different type of courtroom. I think just from my experience in trying to locate individuals as an attorney who have been detained, my concern is just the accuracy of the system. We have a tool that's available to the public where you can actually look up a detainee by A number or by their name. The problem is that that system is not always accurate. Sometimes it is delayed. So you may find an individual and it says that they are at X facility, but in the time since that system was updated, they have now been transferred to Y facility. Another issue is, do you even know the A number? Because oftentimes families don't. It's a 9-digit number, and oftentimes the numbers are very, very similar because they are signed as somebody is being processed, so you are gonna have a very similar number to the person in front of and behind you. They're not easy to remember. So if you don't have the A number, then you're resorting to looking up by name, and a lot of the times on the documents that are issued by DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, names are spelled incorrectly. And if you're dealing with, for example, a Hispanic family where there are multiple names, sometimes those are listed inversely, and that can give you inaccurate results. So that has been my concern since seeing this, and I don't know. I don't have an answer to how that's going to be solved, but I'm very scared, just from my own experience of how difficult that is, how we can repair this harm.
I'll just tell you what it looks like on the ground. So we asked this grandmother, who doesn't know where the grandson is, if she had his A number. And she looked at us like we were asking her if she was from the moon. She had no idea what the A number was, so logistically, on the ground for these families, even if this woman, whose case, it's actually more costly because she was released, it's just incredibly, logistically, it's just really, really complicated.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if the panel could give us any insights into how the zero tolerance policy is being implemented or impacted at legal ports of entry, and also what we're seeing in other ports of entry, like the Canadian border, in Florida. Is this only happening on the Mexican-American border, or is it happening around our country?
So the majority of the people who actually come through the border undocumented, enter without inspection, actually enter through the southern border. There are small numbers of people who enter through Canada. I just read a report over the weekend that they actually are having, ICE has increased its presence in Maine and in New Hampshire. Just randomly stopping people and asking them for documentation. So I'm an American citizen. I clearly have an accent. I could be stopped, anywhere. I mean, if I'm traveling in New Hampshire or Maine, apparently my accent will be enough of a reason for somebody to stop me and ask me for proof of my citizenship. So that is happening. But the zero tolerance policy also has another side of it, which is people who have been here for 20, 25 years, who have had minor issues with immigration, like I mentioned before. That's where it's impacting us here. I mean, these are cases, people who were, immigration officers had the discretion because they had no criminal records and they had humanitarian issues, or it was just simply not a priority. Every single person is a priority right now. It doesn't matter what you did. If you had an old case 20 years ago and your file is coming up through immigration, you're going to be deported, and it's very rare to be granted a stay under this political climate.
So just to answer one piece of that question, you mentioned Canada. So there's actually an agreement between the United States and Canada such that whichever country you arrive in first, that's where you need to ask for asylum. And the reason that we have that agreement makes sense because we've established that Canada does offer very comparable legal protections to people seeking asylum. So just in the sense that, we're talking about somebody who is entering through the Canadian United States border and doesn't have any documentation, they would be told that they have to turn around and ask for asylum in Canada. And then just going off of what Catalina mentioned, one of the impacts of the zero tolerance policy, right, is that these individuals are being criminally prosecuted. Because again, as I mentioned, I absolutely defer to the fact that that is a misdemeanor under our law. But the impact is that, for instance, under the Obama administration, the policy and the prioritization under that administration was to focus on individuals who were terrorists or a threat to national security or had been convicted of felonies or part of gangs. So individuals who had really been targeted as posing a danger to the United States and our citizens. The difference now is that under the Trump administration, that priority list doesn't exist anymore. And moreover, he has said that it's anybody who has committed a criminal offense will be targeted for removal. So now you add to that the zero tolerance policy, where we have individuals who are being criminally prosecuted for what is a criminal offense, i.e. the misdemeanor of entering without inspection. So that makes them instantly a higher target for removal.
Any other?
Yeah, I think we got time for one last question.
So let's get these two, Sean. You said two last ones. We'll be quick.
Hi. The president said something along the lines of basically getting rid of all due process for immigrants entering the country on all levels, so that they won't even have the right to due process or to be heard by a judge, or basically you get to the border, we're just going to send you back. And he tweeted that this weekend, I believe, since that's where we get our information days, Twitter. So if he gets rid of, or I don't even know if he can legally do that, I don't know what's going on, but that would be obviously catastrophic for anyone seeking asylum. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I saw that tweet, and as in so many of these instances, he's just wrong. In other words, we will not have a policy, no matter how much the president wants it, of taking a family or an individual and just tossing him back over the border. That's interestingly enough, when somebody presents themselves, when they're on U.S. soil, they're legally speaking a U.S. person. That means they're entitled to the protections of the Constitution, including due process protection. So this is also, I think, one of the reasons why he's obsessed with the idea of a wall, because though it is a fantasy, a wall theoretically stops you from getting the right to due process that you have. So there's plenty of ways where this can go wrong, but the notion that it would be legal for CBP or anybody else to simply toss people back over the border, that would, a court would step in pretty quickly to stop that idea. Yes, last one, I guess.
My question is a little bit along those lines. My understanding historically was that children coming in with families or without families to the States had access to legal representation, and I was listening to, maybe that's not the case, but I was listening to a podcast the other day that said these 2,300 children that are here do not have access to that, so I'm curious, where does that leave them?
So I think maybe what you're speaking to is, and I think this is actually part of the Flores settlement, which is providing those minors with legal information. And that is true. So oftentimes, I mentioned the young man that I met with the other week, and he had a whole stack of paperwork in Spanish, kind of explaining very, very broadly some of his rights and, asylum and things like that. But these are very, generic forms, and the information that they receive is not specific to their case. It's not the same as having a thorough consultation specific to the circumstances of his situation with an experienced immigration attorney. The difference, and my reaction was just to the fact that it blows my mind, even still to this day, the fact that there is no right to legal representation in removal proceedings. And that's not just for adults. That is for the 9-month-old baby who is in removal proceedings. And just kind of, I had to let that sink in the first time I heard it, right? Because that means that 9-month-old child has to appear in immigration court before a judge, and going up against the attorney for the Department of Homeland Security, has to present her case for whatever form of relief she believes she may be eligible for at her own expense. And if she's not able to afford or locate an attorney, the government will not do so for her. So there is no right to legal representation in removal proceedings, no matter what your age is. Now, thankfully, we in Connecticut, we have a lot of fantastic organizations, like some of the ones that you see up here, that are really doing everything that we can to match individuals with experienced attorneys who are able to help them with these proceedings. But absent that, there is no right to representation.
Just to put an exclamation point on that point, when you take what Kaylee has just said, also with the statistics that she cited about the 1 in 10 versus the 1 in 2 chances of prevailing with or without an attorney, it is shocking. I mean, the immigration court, there is no right to counsel. So people are left to hope they can find a lawyer they can afford, or can kind of get lucky with, a public interest organization who can help them, but it's frightening.
So we have to conclude. Let me end this with something that I know people are hungry for based on the calls and social media that come into my office, which is what can we collectively do? First and foremost, my office, and I suspect the other congressional offices will, as this situation evolves, look for ways that you can help. There are wonderful organizations on the ground, the ACLU, there's an organization called Raíces, which is the Spanish word for roots, that is helping in as much as they can. It does seem that we're moving into a period where lots of people will be held under hopefully slightly less restrictive and awful circumstances than they're being held right now. There presumably will be made opportunities for humanitarian organizations to go in and participate, perhaps even lawyers and others. And so we will keep a very close eye on that and make suggestions. But if I can zoom out here to the big picture, there's really two things that are, if you live in my political world, that are essential right now. There are lots of good policy arguments that we have, and those of us who lean left or on the Democratic Party dive into those policy arguments and sometimes get lost in those policy arguments. We need to make sure that this does not become a policy argument around the separation of children. There is no circumstance under which separating children, as the doctor so well said, is anything other than morally repugnant. None of us want to be complicit in one of those black marks in our history. So we need to continue to use that language. And look, even if you don't have an answer for what happens for reunited children under the floor, that doesn't matter. We don't do things that we know in our hearts are wrong. Secondly, and this takes one step away from the urgency and intensity of moral language where we win, we need to figure out a way, and people like me who spend time on television and others need to figure out a way to stop the destructive characterization of immigration that the president, and I try not to be partisan when I'm in my official capacity, but which has become a little bit of an article of faith for the Republican Party. And there are plenty of good Republicans, there are plenty of Republicans, but it has become an article of faith, certainly for the president, that immigration is a bad thing. And it is a really ugly thing that is done to try to appeal, I think, to communities that don't have a lot of immigration, that are economically challenged, to suggest that it's the fault of the immigrant. This is a current in our history for a very long time. The facts are, and I'm the first to acknowledge, because I live in this world, that the facts don't always persuade. The facts are that immigration is a huge strength for this country. I don't know about you, but I am not a Native American. I have an immigration story too. And there's not a problem we don't look at, whether it's the long-term viability of Social Security and Medicare and what a younger working population makes, what is diversity and cultural excitement in our communities, what is starting of new businesses. Immigrants start new businesses at a rate 3 times that non-immigrants start businesses. And here, and most importantly, and this just turns my stomach, the notion that the president makes every single day that immigration is about crime, and he points to MS-13, immigrant communities and immigrants commit less crime than non-immigrants. And so we need to, not just the moral dimension, but without getting into the weeds of the policy, we need to counter this notion that immigration is about MS-13 and crime and destruction and American carnage, to use the language of the president, to say no, it is who we are. And immigrants start businesses more rapidly than non-immigrants, they commit less crime than non-immigrants, and they provide the kind of cultural and other diversity that is so important to our community. So we need to figure out a way collectively to counter the message that we see on Twitter from the Oval Office with what we know to be the facts and what we know to be powerful moral language. So with that, let me thank this panel, which did a terrific job in laying out all the aspects, and all of you for being here.